don't think it consumes every minute as it did before, but certainly, Madeleine's absence is there constantly. I mean, as Jerry said, although we do have lovely times at Sean and Emily, and although I've now reached that point where I will allow myself to take time out and just relax or enjoy something, her absence is still tangible.
It has been more than 17 years since the night a 3-year-old girl vanished from a quiet seaside town in Portugal. Yet the name Madeleine McCann still echoes like a wound that refuses to close. For her parents, Kate and Jerry, time has not erased the absence. It has only taught them how to live beside it. They laugh, they work, they raise their other children, but somewhere in every smile there lingers a shadow. That shadow began on the evening of May 3rd, 2007, in the resort of Praia da Luz. The McCann family was on vacation, staying in a small ground-floor apartment just a few minutes' walk from the Atlantic. They had come searching for rest, for sunlight, for a few peaceful nights. Instead, they entered history as the center of one of the most haunting mysteries the modern world has ever known. When the news broke, the world reacted with disbelief. How could a child simply vanish from her bed while her parents dined a few meters away? Journalists swarmed the narrow Portuguese streets. Satellite trucks lined the coast. Theories multiplied faster than the police could disprove them. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann became not only a tragedy, it became a mirror reflecting our collective fear of the unknown. Amid this storm of speculation rose a calm but relentless voice. Peter Bleksley, a former detective from Scotland Yard. To him, the case was not only about a missing child, but about the fragility of truth when emotion overpowers evidence. Bleksley would go on to expose the fatal mistakes made in those first crucial hours, errors that may have sealed the fate of the investigation forever. From the very beginning, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was wrapped in confusion. Within hours, speculation began to spread, and soon 4 main theories emerged, each one plausible, each one incomplete. The first theory was the one that gripped the world's heart: abduction by a stranger. It seemed unthinkable that loving parents could harm their own child. And so, the collective imagination turned to the idea of a lurking predator. The McCann's holiday apartment was on the ground floor, its windows easily accessible, the doors not equipped with secure locks. Witnesses spoke of suspicious men seen near the Ocean Club resort in the days before the disappearance, some allegedly taking photographs of children. The possibility of a calculated kidnapping seemed terrifyingly real. Yet, as Peter Bleksley would later emphasize, possibility is not proof. No fingerprints, no DNA, no verified witness ever placed a stranger inside apartment 5A. For him, the abduction theory, while emotionally compelling, rested on air rather than evidence. The second theory was darker still. The suspicion that negligence or even wrongdoing by the parents or their friends, the so-called Tapa 7, played a role. On that night, the adults dined together at a nearby restaurant while their children slept alone in separate apartments. They took turns checking every 30 minutes, or so they claimed. Critics called this reckless, even criminally careless. Some went further, suggesting an accidental death followed by a desperate cover-up. The Portuguese police briefly named Kate and Jerry McCann as formal suspects, and headlines across Europe turned them into villains. But Bleksley, himself a father, was cautious. He admitted he would never have left his children alone. Yet, poor judgment is not the same as murder. Without direct proof, no body, no confession, no physical evidence, this theory remained built on suspicion, not substance. Then came the third theory, the one that still fuels online conspiracies. Madeleine as a victim of organized trafficking. Rumors swirled of pedophile rings operating across Europe, of networks that kidnap children to sell to wealthy couples, or exploit them for profit. Portugal, with its tourist influx and coastal routes, was said to be a transit point. But again, Bleksley cut through the hysteria. Such networks exist, but connection to this case has never been demonstrated. No arrests, no financial trails, no confirmed link between Madeleine and any trafficking group. In his words, speculation may comfort the curious, but it does not solve crimes. Finally, the fourth theory, perhaps the most haunting of all, suggested an accident followed by a cover-up. Maybe Madeleine fell, was over-medicated, or suffered a tragic mishap while the adults were away. In panic, someone could have hidden the truth. Supporters of this idea pointed to inconsistencies in testimonies and to the alert of cadaver dogs inside the apartment. But Bleksley reminded everyone that even trained dogs are fallible and that time erases certainty. Without DNA or a body, an accident remains only a theory. To Bleksley, these four possibilities formed the pillars of a house built on conjecture. Each could be true, yet none had been proven. 17 years later, he once said, "We have theories, not truths." When Peter Bleksley reviewed the case files years later, what shocked him most was not what the police found, it was what they lost. For him, the first few hours after Madeleine's disappearance were the foundation upon which everything else crumbled. On the night of May 3, 2007, local officers from the Polizia Judiciaria arrived at apartment 5A in Praia da Luz, expecting a frightened child to be hiding nearby, not a crime scene that required strict preservation. Their first assumption, that Madeleine had simply wandered off, would prove catastrophic. Instead of sealing off the area, they allowed friends, neighbors, and even hotel staff to walk freely through the apartment. Doors were opened and closed, curtains drawn back, beds shifted, fingerprints smeared, and potential DNA traces destroyed. The scene that should have been treated as sacred ground became, in Bleksley's words, a carousel of contamination. By the time investigators realized they might be dealing with an abduction, it was too late. The apartment was no longer a time capsule of evidence. It was a blur of human activity. Bleksley, a veteran of countless investigations, said bluntly, "Once a scene is contaminated, it can never be restored. The damage is forever." That single failure, he argued, may have doomed the McCann case from the very beginning. The errors didn't stop there. Witnesses were questioned inconsistently, and not all resort employees were interviewed. Mobile phone data from that night, a crucial digital map of who was present, was collected haphazardly. Some records were incomplete, others lost entirely. Even nearby properties were not systematically searched. Each oversight was a missed opportunity, and together they created a chain of weakness that investigators would spend years trying to repair. When Scotland Yard launched Operation Grange years later, they found themselves repeating the work that should have been done on day one. Officers had to reanalyze old phone records, re-interview witnesses, and reconstruct timelines blurred by time and error. Bleksley was clear. This was not an investigation that failed slowly. It failed immediately. He believed that if the Portuguese police had treated the disappearance with the seriousness it deserved from the start, if the apartment had been sealed, if evidence had been preserved, Madeleine's fate might already be known. Instead, what the world was left with was a mystery built on broken foundations. As the years passed and leads grew colder, one name began to dominate headlines across Europe: Christian Brueckner. A German drifter with a long criminal history, Brueckner had lived in southern Portugal around the time Madeleine disappeared. He was known for petty theft, burglary, and sexual offenses against minors. To the public and the press, he looked like the perfect villain, rootless, dangerous, and conveniently located near Praia da Luz in 2007. German prosecutors declared him the prime suspect, convinced that they had finally identified the man behind the disappearance. In 2020, the world watched as prosecutor Hans Christian Walters confidently stated, "We have our man, but we cannot yet prove it." To many, it sounded like a breakthrough, a long-awaited moment of clarity. But to Peter Bleksley, it was a red flag. He had seen what happens when investigators choose a suspect first and then try to fit the evidence around him. "That's not looking for truth," he warned. "That's looking for confirmation." Bleksley dissected the evidence piece by piece. Supporters of the theory pointed to Brueckner's mobile phone data, which placed him in the region of Praia da Luz on the night of May 3, 2007. But "in the region" could mean many things. Cell tower signals covered large areas, and Bleksley reminded everyone that being nearby is not the same as being there. Thousands of tourists, locals, and workers used their phones in the same radius that night. The data could narrow a search zone, but not prove presence inside apartment 5A. Then there were rumors of confessions. Former acquaintances claimed that Brueckner had once spoken about abducting a child, or even hinted at his involvement in Madeleine's disappearance. Yet, every one of these statements came years after the fact, secondhand, uncertain, impossible to verify. Some might have been motivated by reward money or attention. Others may have simply misremembered or exaggerated. Without corroboration, Bleksley dismissed them as hearsay, not evidence. Most damning of all was what wasn't found. No trace of Madeleine's DNA in any of Brueckner's homes, vehicles, or belongings. No fingerprints linking him to the McCann apartment. No eyewitness placing him at the scene. After nearly 2 decades, not a single piece of physical evidence tied him to the crime. Bleksley called this the void at the center of the case, the absence that speaks louder than any theory. Still, the narrative persisted. Brueckner's past made him an easy target, and the public, desperate for closure, clung to the possibility that justice was finally near. But Bleksley warned that building a case on assumption was dangerous. A man may look guilty, he said, but looking guilty is not the same as being guilty. He feared that the fixation on Brueckner had become another form of tunnel vision, just as the early suspicion of the McCanns had been years before. By locking onto one suspect without definitive proof, investigators risked repeating history, chasing shadows while the truth slipped further away. In April 2022, 15 years after Madeleine vanished, headlines once again erupted with apparent progress. Christian Brueckner had been officially declared an arguido, a formal suspect under Portuguese law. To the public, it sounded like a step closer to justice, a sign that prosecutors had finally gathered the evidence they needed. But for Peter Bleksley, the timing told a different story. He understood the deeper mechanism behind that announcement. In Portugal, most serious crimes, including abduction, fall under a 15-year statute of limitations. Once that window closes, prosecutors lose the right to bring charges. Madeleine disappeared in May 2007, and by 2022, that deadline was fast approaching. Declaring Brueckner an arguido effectively stopped the clock. It was not a revelation of guilt, it was an administrative act to buy time. Bleksley explained that this move, though legal, carried the weight of illusion. To the public, it looks like momentum, he said. But in reality, it may only be procedure dressed as progress. The word arguido gave the appearance of breakthrough without the substance of new evidence. No new DNA had been discovered, no witnesses had come forward, and no confession had surfaced. The declaration preserved the investigation's life, but not its integrity. This tactic exposed a tension at the heart of international law enforcement. Different systems, different clocks, different thresholds of proof. In the United Kingdom, for instance, there is no statute of limitations for murder. A case can remain open indefinitely if new evidence appears. But in Portugal, the countdown to closure forces investigators into action, or desperation. By naming Brueckner as an arguido, authorities ensured the case would remain legally alive. Yet to Bleksley, this move highlighted a fundamental flaw. The investigation was surviving on technicalities, not truths. He questioned the motives behind the announcement. Was it truly a sign of progress, or merely a way to avoid public embarrassment when the 15-year deadline expired? He posed a haunting question in one of his interviews. Are they declaring him arguido because they believe they're closing in, or simply because they're running out of time? Bleksley feared that the case had become more about appearances than outcomes, about maintaining the image of pursuit rather than the reality of discovery. He warned that such gestures could mislead the public, raising hopes only to crush them again when no tangible proof followed. The result was a strange limbo. The world believed the case was advancing, while in truth, investigators were still standing still. To Bleksley, this was not justice. It was bureaucracy masquerading as belief. In 2023, a man named Ken Ralph stepped forward with a story that reignited public curiosity. He claimed that, days before Madeleine's disappearance, he'd heard about a disturbing conversation involving Christian Brueckner. Talk of abducting a child and selling her to a childless German couple. It was the kind of revelation that, on the surface, could change everything. But as Peter Bleksley examined it, the cracks appeared almost immediately. Ralph's account was not firsthand. He hadn't spoken to Brueckner directly. Instead, he said he'd heard the story from another man, an unnamed middleman who supposedly relayed what Brueckner had said. It was third-hand information, a whisper passed from one person to another, filtered through time and memory. In the world of criminal investigation, such testimony carries almost no legal weight. "This isn't evidence," Bleksley said bluntly. "It's gossip in uniform." Still, Ralph insisted he had taken the information seriously. He said that after returning to the UK in 2007, he went straight to the police and gave a full statement. But according to him, no one followed up. The report was logged, perhaps, but no interviews were arranged, no additional leads pursued. Years later, he claimed he also contacted Portuguese investigators, only to be met with indifference. "They brushed me off," he recalled. To Bleksley, this wasn't just a story about one man's memory. It was a reflection of a pattern that had plagued the investigation since day one: missed opportunities. Every tip that wasn't verified, every lead that wasn't pursued, pushed the truth further out of reach. Even if Ralph's account had turned out to be unreliable, Bleksley argued that it should have been tested back then, when witnesses were alive, details were fresh, and the chain of communication was intact. Instead, the potential lead was left to die, buried under paperwork and neglect. By the time it resurfaced nearly 2 decades later, it had become little more than a ghost story. Impossible to confirm, impossible to dismiss. Every untested lead becomes a scar on the investigation, Bleksley warned, and this case is covered in scars. The tragedy, he said, was not only in Madeleine's disappearance, but in the failure to pursue truth with urgency. Had investigators tracked down the man in the middle, verified the account, or cross-referenced it with Brueckner's known associates, they might have found something real, or eliminated it entirely. Either outcome would have been progress, but by doing nothing, they allowed speculation to grow in place of fact. Bleksley believed this negligence was emblematic of a deeper issue, an investigation crippled not just by bad luck, but by bad practice. In his view, Ralph's story should have been a chance to learn, not another example of history repeating itself. Instead, it became one more echo in a long corridor of missed chances, a painful reminder of how justice can be lost, not only by what is done, but by what is ignored. To Peter Bleksley, the story of Madeleine McCann was not only the story of a missing child, it was the anatomy of a broken investigation. Every mistake, every delay, every neglected lead had layered upon the last until the truth was buried beneath procedural rubble. By the time the British authorities launched Operation Grange years later, the foundation of the case was already compromised beyond repair. When Scotland Yard detectives revisited the evidence, they found themselves retracing steps that should have been taken in 2007. They re-examined phone records that were incomplete. They re-interviewed witnesses who had long forgotten details. They analyzed the same fragments of information the Portuguese police had mishandled during those critical first hours. What should have been a methodical search for facts had become a desperate attempt to piece together a puzzle with half its pieces missing. Bleksley was scathing in his assessment. "You can't rebuild a crime scene," he said. "Once it's gone, it's gone." The contaminated apartment, the lost DNA, the unverified testimonies, all these errors, he believed, had effectively made the case unwinnable in court. Even if a suspect were to be charged tomorrow, any competent defense lawyer could dismantle the prosecution by pointing to the gaps and inconsistencies created in those early days. But the damage extended beyond the courtroom. Public trust, once high, had eroded with every false dawn. Each new breakthrough announced in the press, each promise of progress, ended the same way. Silence, frustration, and another reminder that hope was fading. For the McCann family, it meant living not only with grief, but with the agony of knowing how much had been lost through incompetence. Bleksley saw in this case a cautionary tale for law enforcement worldwide. His first lesson: treat every missing child report as a potential crime from the start. The cost of overreacting is small. The cost of underreacting can be fatal. His second: avoid tunnel vision. Investigators must chase evidence, not theories. Once they decide what must have happened, they stop seeing what might have. And finally, his third lesson: transparency matters. Secrecy and miscommunication breed conspiracy. And in a case this public, that conspiracy becomes its own kind of prison. Nearly 2 decades later, the investigation remains trapped between hope and futility. Bleksley's conclusion is cold but honest. The mistakes of 2007 didn't just slow the investigation, they crippled it. They turned a solvable mystery into an eternal one. From the moment Madeleine McCann vanished, her case crossed borders. What began as a local investigation in Portugal quickly grew into a tri-national operation involving Portuguese, British, and later German authorities. On paper, it looked like an unprecedented alliance, 3 nations working together to find one missing child. But as Peter Bleksley pointed out, what should have been a strength often became a source of confusion and contradiction. Each country had its own laws, priorities, and definitions of justice. The Portuguese police controlled the original crime scene and held jurisdiction over local evidence. Years later, Scotland Yard launched Operation Grange in the United Kingdom, not as a new investigation, but as a review under intense political pressure from the British government. Meanwhile, the Germans, led by prosecutor Hans Christian Walters, pursued their own inquiry focused entirely on Christian Brueckner, a German citizen. The result was a tangle of overlapping narratives. If a new witness came forward, whom should they contact? The Portuguese police, who had the original case files, the British team, who were re-examining the evidence, or the Germans, who had already publicly declared their prime suspect. This confusion, Bleksley said, risked driving away potential witnesses afraid their information would be lost in translation, literally and bureaucratically. He was careful to note that international cooperation can work. He had seen it succeed in global operations against terrorism and organized crime. But such success requires alignment, a shared strategy, constant communication, and above all, humility between agencies. In the McCann case, he saw little of that. Instead, each country seemed to guard its jurisdiction, protecting its version of the truth rather than pursuing the collective one. Public statements from officials only deepened the uncertainty. The British and Portuguese authorities often described the current moment as the best chance yet to solve the case. The Germans repeated that they had strong evidence against Brueckner, though none of it was ever disclosed. Together, these pronouncements created the illusion of momentum. But Bleksley had heard such promises before. Optimism without evidence, he said, is just performance. He warned that the McCann investigation had begun to resemble theater rather than policing, a cycle of press conferences, headlines, and political gestures designed to keep faith alive rather than deliver results. Each time officials claimed a breakthrough, public hope surged. Each time no proof followed, that same hope collapsed, leaving only deeper cynicism in its place. The differences between the 3 justice systems made true cooperation nearly impossible. In Germany, prosecutors can name a suspect publicly without filing charges. In Portugal, judicial secrecy restricts what can be shared. And in the UK, Operation Grange depends on annual government funding that could vanish at any moment. 3 systems, 3 clocks, 3 versions of the same tragedy, none synchronized. For Bleksley, this disunity was not just procedural, it was moral. When 3 nations can't speak with one voice for a single missing child, he said, what chance does justice really have? He believed that the failure to unify the investigation reflected a broader erosion of faith, not only in the institutions meant to protect children, but in the very idea that truth still matters more than appearances. 17 years have passed since that warm May night in Praia da Luz, and the story of Madeleine McCann remains frozen between hope and despair. Every few years, a new suspect, a new witness, a new theory surfaces, only to dissolve back into uncertainty. The case, like a ghost, refuses to rest. For investigators, the question has changed. It is no longer only who took her or how she vanished, but whether the truth can ever truly be known. For the McCann family, the wound has never healed. They have lived not with closure, but with endurance. Each passing birthday marks not only the years lost, but the relentless absence of answers. We live with the unknown, Kate McCann once said, and the unknown is the hardest part. Experts like Bleksley and former Superintendent Shabnam Chaudhry have reached a sober conclusion. Only 2 things can bring resolution: a confession or a discovery. After countless searches and endless forensic reanalysis, no new physical evidence has appeared. Technology may have advanced, but time has erased what could have been found. Without fresh proof, the case is trapped in limbo, held up by memory and speculation. And yet, amid the despair, one small symbol of hope endures. The unique mark in Madeleine's right eye, where the pupil bleeds into the iris in a distinctive pattern. It was this mark that appeared on posters, billboards, and television screens across the world in those desperate early months. Even now, it remains the thread of recognition that her parents cling to. In a world connected by digital screens and shared images, They believe that maybe, somewhere, someone will see that mark and remember. But Peter Bleksley's words cast a somber balance against that fragile hope. He reminds the world that justice cannot be built on emotion or rumor. Without DNA, without credible witnesses, without tangible proof, we have only stories. And stories, no matter how heartbreaking, cannot stand in a court of law. Hope, he says, is not evidence. For him, the greatest tragedy is not only the disappearance itself, but the squandered chances that followed, the moments when the truth might have been found, but wasn't. Every failure in procedure, every untested lead, every hasty conclusion has pushed the case further from resolution. In his view, the mistakes of 2007 didn't just hinder justice, they defined its absence. And so, the story endures. It endures because the world cannot look away from a missing child. It endures because Madeleine's face, frozen in innocence, became a symbol of every unanswered question. It endures because human beings cannot stand the silence of mystery. We must fill it with theories, headlines, and hope. But, as Bleksley warns, unless new evidence emerges, unless someone breaks the silence with the truth, the Madeleine McCann case will remain what it has always been: a story without an ending. A story that began with a child asleep in her bed on a summer night. And a question that, even after 17 years, still has no answer.